If we conquer the winter, the grasshopper lives and denies the ant his shabby victory. Arcade Spirits is a visual novel by Fiction Factory, written by Ian Schumann and Stefan Gagne, according to the credits on the opening screens. Set in an alternate cyberpunk around about now, in a world where the video game crash of 1983 didn't happen, it casts you as protagonist name here as you stumble out of unemployment through the guidance of a super-intelligent sentient AI in your phone for a bold adventure in managing small workplace problems. As far as the product as a product goes, as far as this visual novel you can buy goes, this game is very strong. Game out of 10. This is a visual novel, and if you know that genre, you'll know the basics of the formula are really quite skeletal. You're involved in a pretty linear narrative made of text blocks, which directed backgrounds and acted entities move on a screen to make. The rest of everything else really is systems, flags and variables behind the screen to track whether things were done or not done earlier on. This isn't even necessary. Some visual novels literally are just forks of written narrative that split off from one another and never need to track variables or flags. At its tightest, a visual novel can be incredibly cheap to produce with one simple linear interface that does nothing strange and uses a tiny number of still images to construct its narrative, characters, and space, and Arcade Spirits is the exact kind of opposite to that. Without ever stepping out of the model of things visual novels do, this game packs pretty much every single added element you can get. There's some voice acting, though it's not fully voice acted. The interface is customized in a lot of different ways, and there are all these things that visual novels can do to save effort that over time accumulate to look cheap. But this game pointedly does not do. Reactions are timed well, avatars move and react in thoughtful ways, camera angles are chosen based on the emotional weight of a scene, and there are a decent variety of interesting splash graphics. Inasmuch as these things are things you can comment on, Arcade Spirits is a very well made, very polished, very thoroughly constructed visual novel. It's long, too. By the standards of visual novels, this game actually took me a few days to get through. There just is a lot of text to read, and it takes a lot of time. I'm not really wild about that, but knowing this is a game that wants to tell a story of a time, and not just a story about basically the two simplest plot beats of a romance, it makes sense. This game isn't just you finding love from a menu, this is a game about living a life and following an actual story with a plot, and an antagonist, and complications, and stuff, and tries to fill itself out. It's structured almost like a Pixar movie. Once upon a time, there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. I think I know the genre well enough to recognize the work of people who like visual novels versus the work of people who have heard of visual novels. On the simplest level of, hey, does this game work? And did you like it? And would you recommend people try it? Yeah, absolutely. All the pieces fit together and it has a coherent narrative that you can pick your way through and its own personal philosophy. It feels like it's doing a lot to please a lot of people. It has a variety of bodies and personalities you can learn about without necessarily feeling like the game is trying to coil around your choices. There's an aggressive amount of work done to make the game accessible and approachable. All the entry-level mistakes for how these games push people away are addressed, and bonus, the deliberate inclusion of pronouns in the character customization pushes away people who you would regard as, well, shitheads. Which means this game establishes its position up front. Good stuff there. So, if that's all you want, does Talon recommend Arcade Spirits, then yeah, absolutely. If you think you'll like it looking at it, you won't be disappointed. If you're not invested in the type of game it is, this is a really high quality version of it you can use as a leaping in point. Everything that goes into making this game is a very good version of what it is. Now, did Talon like this game? That's kind of messier. Let's try circle around on that. Originally, when I started taking notes on this game, when I failed to click with the original vibe, I thought that what I should do is look at the game in terms of the Kalois-Ensslin model of games engagement. Kalois thinks that games have inherent reasons to play them and that people play them to engage with those surfaces, which is hilarious when you start to look at the way people refuse to play games properly and house rule things. The model nonetheless breaks down into the idea of games in these 5 categories. Agonic games, games of direct competition, Aliatic games, games of uncontrolled chance, iLinks games, games of a loss of control, mimicry games, games of impersonation and identity, and Rhythmos games, games of intersection of systems. And you may think, Talon, why do you bring this up for every single visual novel? Well, it's fundamental to understanding it, but also it pads out the bit. I thought at first there was an interesting idea with how Queen Bee relates to optimizing games and gameplay, how her gameplay is primarily agonic. Then there's mimicry that Ashley represents with her cosplay and conversations around identity. Teo brings in eye-links for the idea of losing yourself on the rhythm, playing in a way that short-circuits the mind in a roller coaster of sensation. Then you have Naomi, whose vision of games is as much about the ways they work and the way they make themselves work, the rhythmos of the machinery. And Gavin and Percy are capitalists, so who cares? I'm kidding, don't worry. This model works reasonably well if you just want to throw the dice out there, but I would be surprised if any attention was paid to this idea for the making of it. It's not like it's necessary, and sure, I could expand on each of these stories and show you the ways these ideas work, and maybe, if I dropped the game early and worked with my premise about this format was to use games to talk about anything, that's where I would have stopped. Here's one of the other things, though. Something I didn't think would be a thing, but which very much showed itself to be many things as I played this game. Stefan Gagne is someone whose amateur work on the internet in fanfic spaces and the like has been around for going on 25 to 30 years. Stefan Gagne was one of the cool kids at the big table I sat near in those days of Ranma 1/2 fanfiction that gave me stumbling steps onto the internet. Yeah, I guess token Ranma 1/2 mentioned, but it is Pride Month, so it seems acceptable to me. Though Yagne I remember more for Slayer's fanfiction, Impro fanfic, and most notably, Ultra. What this means is that there's a lot of this stuff here that, while definitely quirky, has a feeling that I, nostalgically, can't help but think of as being very Stefan. This isn't a knock against his work. He's really good at this particularly deliberate, quirky voice, a voice that feels a lot like, and I say this with no idea where Stefan came from, just that he's in America now. An American who didn't click well with local comedy, but loved Red Dwarf and the works of Terry Pratchett. This can come through in the extremely specific, the back and forth of Ben and Matt's wordplay, for example, and the extremely broad. Yagne's work has been pretty much consistently operant around taking an absurd situation as seriously as possible. There's a clear and deliberate use of character voice. Every character stands apart from one another. You can't reasonably mix up the way different characters talk with one another. There's a point where three characters have a conversation with one another and they all have the same name and ostensibly the same core personality, and yet all three of them are clearly distinct. This does mean that a lot of characters are very funny and very interesting and in different, isolated ways. It's not as simple as, hey, here's this archetype, knock yourself out, because of the routes I played, each character showed that there was some detail about them that undermined that idea of how the archetype formed, while still being completely coherent with them. There are some affects that don't land for me because nothing will. For example, in his introduction, Gavin pretty much just straight up lays out the explanation of the game's themes and the point of the location like he's handing out the study guide, and then also describes himself in a phrase that's extremely practiced and reminds me of one of the YouTube sleuths who describe themselves as empaths. Like, I get it, this is a space that wants to get the narrative moving as quickly as possible. It's not like this is a bad thing to do this way, it's just, it makes Gavin feel like someone that I immediately do not trust. This is because I am suspicious of anyone who wants to volunteer to me quickly the way they see the world. It's a format problem, really. The game has to get you on board with these characters quickly. It's not their fault it comes at the expense of making Gavin seem like a ding-dong. Distinct character voice, interesting characters, meaningful reactions to things. You could do a lot worse than play these games learning how to get better at writing characters in visual novels. If you remember me talking about the Somnium Files, you might remember me saying that the game pulls over in the middle to give you a lecture about the meanings of a character's name, that the game has this sort of fundamental sincerity about itself, how it wants to make sure it absolutely is holding the point it wants to club you with in two hands. Well, Arcade Spirits is less subtle, but, well, you know what we say in these parts.
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
In the middle of Arcade Spirits, there's a point where the game pulls over and decides to sit on the side of the road as it hammers home its thesis statement about games and arcade culture and life, in the form of fighting ghosts inside an urban legend video game called Polybius. Now, for those of you who don't know about it, Polybius is basically a creepypasta about what if the CIA was using video games to recruit teenagers in the 80s, which, haha, of course not, that's how the US military recruits, not the CIA. But don't worry, it involves a good dash of German because it leads to spooky sounding words. But in this section of the game, you have what amounts to a dream sequence powered by a ghost video game that wants you to make moral choices or tell it how you're feeling.
You can't just have your characters announce how they feel! That makes me feel angry!
And finally, you have a chat with an actual honest-to-God ghost. But, you know, not a ghost, just a ghost like the other ghost you see later in the game while you think you're dying. Don't worry about it, you're fine. The actual exchange, though, struck me looking at it. It was the closest I could find to the game about game arcades presenting a thesis statement about games. The idea was that someone could play games too much. That games were somehow important, very important as a shared cultural thing, based on how Naomi talks about them, but also the haunting question, what if games, but too much? Which isn't a point that rings aloud to me. It's worse too, because it says, what if games but too much, as long as you have a giant pile of money and a haunted CIA brain-mashing machine. Which, I don't think the actual tragedy there is she gamed herself to death, as much as a CIA superweapon killed her and we're treating it like that's her fault. There is a tragic irony in that this game takes a break to say, why not play games forever, as if that's haunting, as if it's something you can get lost in. It puts me in mind of, and yes, if you know me, take a drink as I bring it up, Bernard Suits' The Grasshopper. Life, Games, and Utopia, which gives us our leading paraphrase. There's this idea of pursuing your dreams and not being satisfied with merely being happy and content, and how there's a natural growth and invocation of success that comes from the ongoing time at the funplex. There's an inextricable link between the incrementation of careers and the improvement at a job, and that's seen as the alternative to, what, giving up? I don't mean to sit here all invisible bullets and sneer at this game for having bad politics because it frames getting a dream job full of friends and family as being a good thing. It is the way it is, but it made me look at the world of it and ask the question you're meant to ask that, hey, is it okay to always be playing games? It's interesting because it means that this story is not so much about games, nor games as they're played or how people play them or even what playing them is like, but about people who care about arcades. It's a hit of nostalgia deep into the vein for a thing that still exists, just not here. Myself, I think games are good. I think people getting to play is good. I think that if the world could choose how much play we have versus how much work we have, I would imagine the optimal would be for there to be no work and just play. That nobody should be doing jobs that they didn't find fun. That nobody should be trying things they don't want to do. When technology progresses past a certain point, there's a lot of types of work that stop being necessary, stop needing to be incentivized the way they are. The world of arcade spirits is rich and full of mysterious powers. There are sentient AI that want to make people's lives better, and not just their code, and there is hypothetically justice for evil. There's no reason for anyone in a world like this to have to suffer, to have to be denied and reliant on the works of the weird and the wealthy. Yet in the same space, running an arcade is more important than anything that the arcade lets you do. And in the end, you are also beholden to someone with more money than you to make your dream happen. It's not an inherent evil of the game or anything. I certainly wouldn't tell the game it should be different, but it is a bummer. Still, why was it so hard for me to play this game? Why did I feel at the start like I wasn't going to romance anyone and yet didn't pick the aromantic option? That's a weird thing to do, right? It's not that I don't think the characters aren't romanceable. Every one of them has some interesting traits that make them desirable or interesting or charming or Gavin. There's a lot to like in all these characters, and I am glad I did do the Ashley romance when I did, because it gave me insight into one character that feels, on the one hand, like it's a spoiler to discuss, but which also feels like it's worth mentioning as a type of representation for those young queers out there. You know, the young queers with nostalgia for 1980s arcades. I think in the end though, part of it is that I can't get over feeling voyeuristic in this game. I can't feel that I'm the character that I'm meant to be piloting, like they're not someone I can inhabit. I joked last year that the iconic millennial was someone who likes naps and wants to die, but that's not what informs this character. Instead, it's depression in the face of a gig economy and a sense of perpetual failure. I think that's part of the engagement axis for this character. You need to be able to tap into that feeling of millennial despair, that feeling that the world has it out for me and that's it. I think I'm not like that. I don't think I'm nostalgic for the days of arcades, for a childhood before it all went wrong, because I never had that. I had a very different childhood. Arcades were something kids with money did. Games and arcade cabinets were something that asked $1 of you to play, and that was so much money to me. There were always these endlessly showy games of a totally different type to the ones I played. There's a weird little irony that two arcade games that I never played during my childhood, the things that made me think, oh yeah, that's something I wish I could try, were brought together in a game called Pong Combat, which was developed by Stefan Yagne when he was a teenager. Part of what I try to do with this channel is to communicate clearly about games as myself, that you can know what I like and you can recognize the way you react to the things I tend to like. That means that in this kind of game, where I have to center myself, I get to look even more intently at the things I mean when I talk about my feelings about a game. Part of that is going to be about showing you how I feel, how the game makes me feel about something that's explicitly meant to be romantic, and that means how I feel about the thing that the game tells me I get to be as a romantic subject, and how true that can feel to something I personally can inhabit. It's weird, isn't it? I am part of the interface. Why do I play? What can I pretend to be? I like this game a lot more than I liked playing it. I like what this game wants to be more than I liked trying to be myself in it. I like these characters much more than I liked the world they have to live in. And I don't regret the time spent on this game, not one moment. But Christ, it was hard. And I worry a lot about what that says about what I think of being me.